Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park here with Charlie Araujo. How are you today, Charlie?
I am great. We have hints of spring. I'm super excited. Lots and lots of work going on. So never a dull moment. All good. How about you?
Yeah, same here. Bay Area is gorgeous as usual. We are in the middle of whatever this spring, summer, fall season is.
Well, I'm sure I've jinxed it because it's 50 degrees here today and it was sunny. And so I'm sure that means we're due in for some more snow or something. But it is gorgeous today. We'll take it. But
Excellent. Yeah, so it's been an interesting week in the news from a tech perspective. We've been seeing some interesting things happening from a geopolitical perspective and some basic science, some primary science happening, some interesting products that have been launched and funded, some interesting business announcements and decisions that are reflecting perhaps some economic changes that are happening on a global scale, and we're going to dig into all of those. But perhaps we should start with what I thought was the biggest news last week, which was Microsoft's announcement around quantum computing. I feel like that definitely got the most buzz, even if it may not be the most directly important one for CIOs at the moment.
well, I'm going to start by saying, actually, I do think it's an important topic for CIOs. It's just not an important near-term topic.
Mhm.
But I think it's way above my pay grade in trying to understand what the heck they're talking about. The entire quantum computing thing is one of those areas that if you're a CIO, you have to have your eye on it. If for no other reason than the ultimate risk to security protocols that quantum computing represents and being able to break encryption and potentially and what have you. I think there's also, especially with the dawn of AI, there's lots of potential for quantum computing could be the thing that sort of causes breakthroughs or enables things like AGI in terms of its computing power, which is why there's this push. So I think there's a few interesting parts to this story. And if you aren't following along, so Microsoft announced a new processor that they've been working on around quantum computing. And one of the things that made the big news is they supposedly have created, which I learned right, they didn't really create, but a novel particle, which is like
Yes. Hmm.
I think we're talking about any of this in the context of IT is bewildering to me, but this new particle that supposedly helped them solve some of the problems around quantum computing. So the two big things that were newsworthy or interesting, the first was this idea of a new particle, whatever that meant, and the second though that was Microsoft, because Microsoft is not someone that we historically have talked about in the context of quantum computing, and this is them sort of jumping onto the scene in a very big way. And I think more than anything else, if I put my CIO hat on, it sort of solidifies where Microsoft is going, the investments they're making, that they're looking very long term. I've always said that CIOs invest in vision, and vision takes a lot of forms, and this is one of them, right? Especially if you're a company like Microsoft is casting your net far into the future, and inviting your customers to get on board with it. I thought it was interesting. So, I mean, you probably know more about this stuff than I do. I mean, what was your take on all of it?
You know me, I love nerding out on the science stuff. So, in case you haven't been keeping up with quantum computing, basically, this is a way to use atoms the same way that we think about bits and bytes. So, ones and zeros are what computing is made of. So, the big difference is that in quantum, we're using electrons often for to figure out based on the spin of the electron, whether that's a one or a zero. And then it gets really weird because electrons are really weird, protons are really weird, subatomic particles are really weird. And the super weird thing here is that Microsoft has been investing in this Majorana particle approach for almost 2 decades now. It's not easy to do. The Majorana particle is a super weird thing where it is two-dimensional, and it is and basically you have two bits on either side, and they can instantly transport to each other's positions because weird two-dimensional wave duality, things. But the idea is that you put one bit on the edge of one wire and then the other bit at the edge of another wire inside a transistor, and then you're able to basically flip those back and forth. And that's what Microsoft is saying that they're able to do. I mean, so, fancy spancy. I'm not quite sure whether that's actually true or not. We haven't quite seen all of the scientific detail. But if this is true, Microsoft has a big advantage because this is an approach that can be repeated in more of a transistor or processor, microprocessor type approach, whereas everybody else is basically trying to trap atoms and make sure the atoms don't conflict with each other. And this is very hard to do, aligning individual atoms and line them up and not having them interfere with each other. Microsoft technically has a better way of doing this if they can show that this can scale. And as we all know, most of the quantum computing we've been seeing is 3 qubits, 5 qubits, 10 qubits, basically 10 bits. Because they're still trying to figure out the primary science on how this works. But we all know that if you can get to 100 or 1,000 of these and do that consistently, you start being able to crack basically any encryption or protect yourself against from any encryption attacks, one way or the other. So that's where it starts getting really interesting.
Yeah, and I know there was, as I said, way above my pay grade. I can't process most of this, but I know there was some pushback, I guess is the word, from some of the scientific community saying, "Hey, they haven't shown their work completely. We're not sure if this is really true." So I think it's just sort of one of those interesting data points, but something to keep your eye on, that they have at the very least announced themselves as a player in this space that has been bubbling for a decade now,
Yeah, IBM
and
has
has
made a
never
lot of
quite.
noise in this space as well. So I see that this is now, Microsoft and IBM now have their quantum approaches, and this is starting to become a real market instead of just these, onesie twosie, startups. Honestly.
And I do think it's interesting. I think to a certain extent, you said you went where I was sort of going, that the big loser in this is probably IBM, right? IBM has been sort of teetering on this point of struggling to find continued relevancy in the market. Lots of acquisitions, lots of stuff. They obviously still have lots of revenue, all of that, but we rarely talk about them, right? And we rarely talk about them because they're right now have been sort of relegated to building block sort of stuff. And the one exception to that has really been quantum computing. And so having a company like Microsoft, who on the converse is constantly in the press about AI and everything else, that, I think does not bode horribly well for IBM. But, all that said, I think we are still years, maybe even a decade from any of this to really coming to reality. So plenty of time for all of that to change. Speaking of stuff beyond and above my pay grade, there's also a bunch of big news out of at the geopolitical level, which I know you love, out of China. So probably the big thing, there's a couple different parts of this story. The first is that Alibaba announced, I think, $52 billion in spend commitments over the next 3 years. Notable because it's a big public, big spend thing, smaller than what Microsoft has announced their spending, smaller than what OpenAI has been spending. So not a game-changing number out there. But I thought was most interesting was that China, the country, has sort of put a stake in the ground and had this pretty eventful meeting with the CEO. Well, Alibaba's founder or co-founder Jack Ma was there, someone that we haven't seen in the press for a long time. Huawei CEO was there, and DeepSeek was there, a number of other players, and it's becoming very clear that China is investing in this space, and in so doing, seems to be laying off a little bit, and some of the pressure or constraints that they were putting on the private companies like Alibaba. And so I think that is interesting and noteworthy, and maybe a signal. Well, I'm not sure if it's a signal, if that's a good sign for the space, that these Chinese companies can operate more freely in the normal markets, or if it's a more threatening sign. Now, what was your take on all of it?
Yeah, to me, it feels like the start of an AI Cold War where both sides are going to dump hundreds of billions of dollars to show who has the better AI. It's going to be a little bit like either the nuclear race or the space race. I'm not sure how we're going to determine who wins, since we're starting to have trouble figuring out which AIs are actually smarter than the others, but which we'll get to later. But for now, I think it's really interesting. But that Alibaba's here, Huawei is obviously going to do their thing. DeepSeek is going to keep building on what they have, and of course on our side, the United States side, we have this 500 billion-dollar Stargate initiative, and we'll see how that goes. But there's no doubt that there's a ton of money being pledged to invest in AI.
And we can't forget the EU just had a big conference. I think it was 2 weeks ago. I'm not even sure if we covered it. And led mostly by France, and of course, France is the home of Mistral, and there was I think announced $120 billion initiative to invest. So you are correct that everyone is sort of going in this. What I find is sort of remarkable, and we'll talk about Apple here in a second as well, and slightly disingenuous around it, is that. Um, None of these companies really are nationalistic in the way we used to think about, some of the arguments of like U.S. Steel as an example, right?
Mhm.
Where it was a very U.S. based or any country based industry. Every one of these companies operates on a global basis. Every single one of them has massive operations, and I mean the Chinese may be the more of the exception, but clearly all the Western companies operate on a massive global footprint. Um, and so we talked about that with the Stargate announcement and companies making these big pledges. Apple is just in the news because Tim Cook has announced adding, I forgot what the number was, but like 20,000 jobs or something in the U.S. and building
Right.
factories here.
Mhm.
Um, and but to call Apple a U.S. based company, I know they're headquartered in California, obviously, but they have such deep operations everywhere in the world. Is that really even true anymore? And so I think it is interesting, and I think to your point, it's going to be very difficult to know what quote unquote winning means. But what is clear is that we're going to see lots of movement. This is a ton of money being thrown around, lots of investment, and there's no way for it not to have a major impact and just continue to have a high rate of change with all of it.
Right. At least in the short term, AI will continue to evolve quickly. Models will improve. I'm not sure if the people who create the better models will end up profiting from those models, given some of the other shifts that we've been seeing in AI are about being able to copy quickly and take advantage of new training and inference strategies. But there will be a lot of primary progress made.
Yeah. And I do think one of the side effects, we've talked about this in various forms over the last year, really, that we've been doing this show, is that we're seeing this continual evolution to larger companies, that enterprises are investing in these larger platforms. And you're seeing that sort of go the other way. I've been sort of critical of ServiceNow a little bit. And it's not just ServiceNow, Salesforce, all of these. You have to be a really big company now to get their attention.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that another piece of news from a company that isn't anywhere near that same level of sort of mind share, and that is Avaya. And they just with their, so you found this, right? That they have their Avaya experience platform they call AXP, and they made an announcement that they're changing the minimums of their seat count to get, I really, I guess, to use the product at all, which is just utterly fascinating to me. Um, so maybe you can kind of walk us through that, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it's just that AXP, the Avaya Experience platform, is their contact center platform, and they're basically saying that they are going to cut off customers that have less than 200 seats. And they sent out this note basically saying, yeah, we realize this might be an operational problem for you. We're also going to cut off things like Avaya SIP trunking that you might be using to support voice in your organization. They're basically cutting off products and focusing on what is most profitable at the highest scale. And in Avaya's case, they've been loaded with debt and really need to make some smarter decisions. But I think this is also a trend that has been happening in the enterprise software world too. In other cases, VMware being the most obvious example, because everybody wants to be more profitable and more productive and more efficient, at least in theory. Even the ones that are, even companies that are already profitable, everybody is just trying to chase after the top. And I see the mid market as kind of being abandoned, and perhaps this market is a new opportunity for some startup that just wants to copy what has been created before, but do it in a cost effective manner.
I do think it's interesting. I think that it speaks to a few things. One is I think organizations for years, when it's been all about growth and expansion, are now starting to double down and focus on much more narrow niches. They're saying this is where we can win. This is where we want to play. And for a lot of companies, particularly those like these large companies that have to hit large growth numbers, and to your point of seeking profitability, that often pushes them to the higher end of the market. It is very expensive for them to go down market. And so I think we're going to continue to see that sort of evolution. If you're a large company, I think focusing on partnering with these other large companies that are selling into large, it's going to be that sort of alignment. And then if you're someone like Zoho, as an example, this is really good
Mhm.
news, right? As we see this sort of evolve around the landscape, because that small to medium sized enterprise market becomes, wide open for the taking. So, I think it's just a data point. I think if you're a CIO, I think it used to be a common platform, a common playing field, and now I think you're going to see a much more measured approach to say, based on kind of how big a company you are, that may dictate the type of companies you're choosing, and it may not be the quote unquote best of breed. That may in fact not be your best choice.
Mhm.
Um, so interesting. Other industry news, and again, I'm going to kick this one over to you just because I'm fascinated by it. But talking about picking and choosing, obviously, we talk a lot about AI. We've actually been somewhat remarkable. We've only sort of touched AI on the edges so far on today's show, which is, a change for us. But talking about, there's an interesting, well, from my standpoint, interesting that AI, or GitLab rather, is being sued, um, and its executives being sued over effectively hype, over AI hype. And I think that's an interesting thing, because AI hype is so rampant that they're being kind of, I don't want to say singled out, because I don't want to say they don't deserve it. I'm curious your take on it, but it was an interesting sort of development that they're being held to account for overselling their AI capabilities.
Right. So I actually find this a little bit odd myself that GitLab is now dealing with 3 lawsuits associated with having put a price on their AI that they were excited and bullish about, and then it ends up they didn't build the amount of business that had been expected or estimated, which I find to be odd because honestly, anybody who really thinks they can predict how much AI they're going to be selling in the here and now, that's a lie. Some things are going to take off like a rocket ship, and some things are going to fall like a lead balloon. And honestly, it's not even all marketing's fault. Sometimes you're just hitting the market 6 months too early or 6 months too late. All sorts of reasons that these things can happen. But because GitLab is struggling to sell AI, the Duo product specifically, the apparently investors got angry about these claims and saying that GitLab was making bad claims about the AI that they have in place.
It'll be curious to see how this plays out. I mean, there we could sit here and probably spend a half an hour naming companies that have hyped up a product that hasn't been delivered in the
Mhm.
market. I'd say right now that's the norm, much more than the opposite. I think in most cases, the difference, if I think of Salesforce or ServiceNow or Microsoft, which I think all sort of fall in this category, that thus
Mhm.
far right now have been more about the hype than the delivery. The difference is all of them have also outperformed the market in their traditional businesses, and I think that may be part of the difference. Or it will be interesting to see if these lawsuits end up exposing that there is some outright, hey, we completely made this stuff up, and we had, it was not, this wasn't just hype, it was actually false. So it'll
Mhm.
be interesting to see which way that goes, and I think it will be, from a CIO perspective, something that may be a warning signal, as we sort of, as I think we sort of reach through this trough of disillusionment and start coming into operationalization of it, how that all starts playing out. To that same sort of end, I think it's interesting, and this is sort of way afield of what we would normally talk about, but T-Mobile announced a deal with New York City on their on a contract for first responders, and you thought there was an interesting sort of CIO angle here. So why don't you tee this one up?
Yes. So in New York City, they had been they had been doing an RFP for their 911 services. Obviously, this is important, being able to take 911 calls and requests from the 10 million people in New York City and being able to make sure those calls go through. This has traditionally been a contract owned by AT&T, but T-Mobile came in and said, we're going to shift over your 911 service from 4G to 5G. And more importantly, we're going to do this thing called network slicing, where we're going to give you a preferred access to the network, basically cut out, call it kind of like a virtualization of the network. We're going to cut out a section of the network and assign that specifically to 911 services. And New York City said, hey, that sounds great. Better performance, cheaper. And we frankly have part of the network that nobody else has access to. Sign us up. So, in and of itself, I think that's great. But I do wonder what this means for network services in general, where we have been used to a net neutral or net neutrality type of approach where we're all pretty much buying the same thing. And now it looks like potentially we can start buying preferential access to a network, or we can price, or vice versa, carriers can start pricing app access differently on networks.
So I think it's interesting. This obviously is their cellular, or what we used to call cellular service.
Mhm.
But I think the big question that you're raising is, will this cascade, and will we see some of this? Because we can just as easily, in fact, I would argue more easily, do this in the traditional sort of internet space, connectivity space. And I think this has been a very hot topic for a lot of folks. I have never been horribly worried about net neutrality, mostly because I think the actual operationalization of it in practice, both politically in terms of the minds and the hearts and minds of consumers, as well as technically, there's a whole lot of complication to it and a whole lot of things that go wrong. And I'm a firm believer that organizations tend to pick the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance here is give me a pipe and don't worry about what's on it. So we'll see. I think that this is an example. I'm not sure if it's a replicable example, but it's an example that this is the case where the technical capabilities were something that they could overcome and leverage to create a market advantage. So I think it'll be interesting. I know back in the day, I'm dating myself, but I bought dark fiber back prior to the internet existing, for that very reason. It was from a carrier, and I bought dark fiber to connect my hospitals and my major facilities, because I wanted to create a competitive advantage over my competitors who were using the publicly available connections. So it makes sense. I understand it, but I think there's a lot of complication to it. So we'll have to see if this plays out in any meaningful way beyond this particular contract.
Yeah, I wonder how it will work out in terms of agentic AI. Perhaps a company like Salesforce wanting to provide mobile AI services and using cellular. Perhaps that might be a thing. Obviously, streaming services, something like Netflix. Netflix will want preferred access if possible for something like cellular services. And so I can see niche cases. I don't think this is necessarily a widespread enterprise concern yet, but I do think it's something to consider if you've got millions of mobile users. So that's only a handful of you out there.
Well, speaking of interesting developments around all of this, I think there is another one. And this is sort of the wide other end of the spectrum. A company called Pin AI, not to be confused with Humane's AI Pin, which we don't have in our news lineup. But if you missed it, they just got, the pieces, I guess, just got acquired by HPE. So one of our first sort of high profile fails in the AI space. In either case, Pin AI is really just launching, and it almost defies explanation. It's really hard to understand what this is, but effectively, it's a personal assistant that has an LLM, or I'm guessing it's more of an SLM, that's personalized and runs like on a device. And the fundamentals idea behind it is very similar to what Apple Intelligence is trying to pitch, except agnostically, right? So without having to be relying on Apple products, with the idea being that you can deliver this highly personalized service, using this AI that has access to all of your data and can do that securely because it's running locally on your device. which presumably would be a phone or a computer or whatever it might be, but it has access to all of that. And so the example that the article gives is that you could tell this AI to buy a gift for your mom, and it has all the contextual awareness of, it knows who your mother is, it maybe knows what she likes, knows the stores that you have an account with, has access to your credit card, it can literally do this whole thing. I think it's pretty Nirvana-y at the moment to to express that. But what I do think is interesting, and the reason I wanted to bring this article up, is that I do think this is directionally where it's all going. I'm certainly what we're doing in Symphony. I think what we're seeing evolve in the entire market is this idea that we need context. That for any of this to go beyond what the simple OpenAI chatbot get truly useful, we need that context. And as we start introducing this idea of personalized context, it's a slippery slope that we have to deal with all of these challenges of both efficacy as well as security and privacy. And it's a very difficult challenge. And so I think it's going to be interesting. I'm glad to see they're out there. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the market reacts and responds. And if people get like, oh, that's just cool, I can't wait. Or if they go, oh, hell no, I don't want it having that level of information access. So, I mean, what was your take on this particular announcement?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that they do have some level of usage already, at least for the app and model part of their offering. So they seem to have figured out some sort of use case, but I also agree that the bigger picture is that AI is becoming more about personalization, about context, and about trust. So personalization without trust just means you feel like you're being stalked or you're being overseen, which is not necessarily the right feel for AI that should be productive. It might be the AI that the CEO wants, but it's not the AI that the workers want. So if you want the workers to use this AI, it needs to feel trusted and more organic in nature, in terms of when you're using it, where you're using it, how you're using it. So we'll see how this pin works specifically, but I don't disagree with the basic approach.
Yeah, and I should say the PIN part is meant to imply like your personal identification number, right? That's
Yes.
what they're trying to
The
imply. This
intelligence
idea.
network. Yes.
Yeah,
Personalized
yeah.
intelligence network. Yes.
No,
Not.
yeah, but I'm saying I'm like keying into that same idea that we have a PIN. That PIN is personal to us and unlocks our personal data, right? That sort of reference. At least that's how I took it. But
Right.
I do think it's interesting as well, because the other part about this is that the way they're doing some of this, because again, if we contrast this with Apple's approach, part of the reason Apple is talking about being able to do things that they think that they're claiming they'll be able to do with Apple Intelligence is because it's a closed ecosystem that they control.
Mhm.
And so therefore they have all this. Well, for anyone that's not Apple, if you don't have that closed ecosystem, that walled garden, then how do you do that? Well, they're doing it via blockchain, something that other than talking about crypto, which, thanks to the Trump administration got this sort of bump, we haven't really
Mhm.
talked about blockchain in a while. It was another one of these hyped up technologies, sort of came and then faded. And so it's interesting that they're using blockchain for this, which introduces its own set of issues. Part of the reason that blockchain sort of lost that luster is because of the overhead and the latency with running blockchain transactions, particularly
Mhm.
at scale. So it's really curious to see how that part will develop. But all that aside, I do think that this is directionally where it's going, whether this particular implementation is the one that wins or not. I think that if you're a CIO, if you're a tech vendor, this is something you need to be paying attention to, because this is, I think, where everything is headed.
Yeah, I might actually be a little concerned about the blockchain use case in this particular instance, just because it doesn't scale very well from a speed perspective. You're limited to you typically around 8 transactions per second. If you haven't figured out how to parallelize it to some extent, so I'll be interested in that part as well. But uh, we'll see if they have to upgrade that over time.
So another, speaking of upgrades, in this case, an upgrade in valuation, a company called Codeium just raised a new funding round. And what is notable about it is it's a new round at a 2.85 billion valuation. which is interesting because that puts him at roughly 70 times ARR, which is a substantial premium. And this company is effectively competing with the GitHubs of the world, as well as people like Magic and Poolside, etc. But it's basically it's a coding copilot, a coding assistant. They just introduced. I happen to look. They just introduced an entire AI powered IDE. Cool stuff. But I think you and I were both scratching our head a little bit because what neither of us are really seeing is why this premium in valuation. And the only theory I can posit is that, interestingly enough, despite all the talk and hype about AI, the only place that there seems to be really defensible ROI in most enterprises right now is in coding based copilot. So maybe this is a sign of future valuation bumps for all these other players. I don't know, but I mean, what was your take? Why did you bring this article up, and what was your take on it?
Yeah, first of all, I just found it fascinating that their valuation was so much higher than other coding assistants that have also gotten funding. There's no doubt that this is going to be a big market, and probably I'm not going to be surprised to see this become a multi-billion-dollar market over time, because you want code assistants to help with coding, and coding is a high cost skill. So no real surprises there. But I was also a little bit amused that I feel like the real reason for this valuation is simply that they have figured out how to sell this at an enterprise level. They sell to businesses rather than individual developers. Whereas I feel like a lot of these tools are aimed at simply trying to get viral usage. Uh, we are starting to see that it's not always just about being viral. Sometimes it's simply about being able to get that contract into the enterprise and force your tool in as a piece of the stack, or a piece of the platform.
So I know you mentioned that before we went on air here, but what I find interesting about that assessment, and obviously they are going after the enterprise market, they're
Mhm.
obviously taking that sort of top-down approach, and that does differentiate them from almost everyone else, not just in the coding assistant space, but really anyone that targets coders or developers. That there tends to be the PLG, the product-led, bottoms-up approach is
Mhm.
the conventional norm. That said, they are competing with Microsoft. Microsoft, which owns GitHub, and while GitHub started that way, as far as the bottom-up motion, there's really no question that they're an enterprise play now. If
Mhm.
for no other reason than Microsoft owns them, so it seems odd that this would represent that kind of evaluation bump.
Yeah, and Google is still out there. They obviously have great AI. They obviously know how to support developers as well. Yeah, I'm what can I say? I'm happy for them for raising so much money. Like, bravo. Seriously, good job. But just be aware that raising this much money is also a commitment to start selling a lot. So be careful, guys. And good luck out there, Codium. That's
No,
my
no
honest take.
question. Well, and speaking of needing a little luck and adapting to the times, our last serious article, anyway, is actually from MIT Technology Review, and I particularly found this one fascinating. We've talked in the past about, was AI eliminating the need for SEO, or was there an issue with AI SEO and what that meant?
Mhm.
And this article is entitled "Your Most Important Customer May Be AI." And the what I think is so interesting and challenging with that, or with the idea here, is that the premise what isn't really about SEO exactly. It's about looking at AI as a new kind of consumer of your website or of your data. And it gives an example. The opening paragraph of this article is imagining that you have a meal prep company. So one of these, like, I forget the name of them, but these companies that sell prepared meals and what have you, and that AI sees their ads and describes the company as complicated and confusing. And the reason is that in the ads is talking about chopped chives, and that
Mhm.
nobody wants to do that, and therefore this is this this thing, that how it's interpreting it. And so this article is talking about the fact that we now need to start looking effectively at the content we produce and how we position ourselves in the market through the lens of how AI is going to interpret that and see it. And we'll see. I mean, I found it's compelling and thought provoking. I'm not sure I buy it, in that in the end our goal is to create AI that sees the world as we do, to give us the information that we need in a way that's meaningful. But in the short term anyway, this may be one of those hacks that if you sort of crack this code, that it could create an advantage. So it was just an interesting angle of just recognizing that fundamentally AI is ultimately changing everything.
But I think another interesting piece that, of the puzzle that got brought up in this article is that each model will have its own specific set of assumptions and preferences and biases and blocks. So as let's go with a political example, a Chinese political example in this case. Winnie the Pooh gets brought up as a derogatory mention of Xi, in China. If you try to use Winnie the Pooh references on a Chinese model, it will probably block what you're doing. If you're comparing yourself to Winnie the Pooh, even in the most harmless manner as an American product, you're not going to reach a Chinese customer using AI. And things like that are going to, like little things like that are going to be really important to consider, whether you're working with an EU-based model, a US-based model, or a Chinese model, which kind of seem to be the three centers right now, and having to realize that you're going to have to culturally understand each of these models is interesting, especially at a time when we are talking about perhaps homogenizing some of our own culture and influence in the United States, or ironically going to have to be more multinational in our approach to work with AI, because that's just the way AI world works.
Yeah, and what I do think is interesting about that is that, if I think about if you're a marketer and you're looking at it from an SEO perspective, it was complicated and it was difficult because Google changed their rules all the time. But at the very least, and then they were obscure, right? You didn't know. They were opaque, I guess I should say, about it. You didn't know exactly what the rules were. Everyone was sort of guessing and trying to hack it. But at least it was one entity. It was Google. And now, to your point, you're having to look at this from any number of perspectives. And we're not even talking about the fact that within a large enterprise, if you're targeting enterprise buyers, as an example, they may very well be instituting policies where you're not using the public models. You're using some kind of a custom model that's accessing the internet, and they're tuning that in its own way. So it's going to really, which is why in the end, I'm saying I'm not sure I'm buying this over the long haul, but in the short term, I think it definitely introduces some interesting challenges as you try to sort all that out.
Absolutely.
Which leads to our last final fun story. We always try to end on something either funny or ridiculous, and this one falls into the ridiculous category. I don't think we even covered this. I'm not sure what that says about us, but what last week or the week before, xAI, which of course is Elon Musk's AI company, introduced Grok 3, which at the time purported to beat most of the other major models on a series of benchmarks. And I think we from my standpoint anyway, it didn't raise it, up to my level of wanting to talk about it, mostly because I'm just exhausted talking about these incremental improvements model to model and this week's leaderboard and all of that.
Yeah.
I think what DeepSeek showed us was that we're seeing commoditization of this more than anything else, and these little minor breakthroughs are generally not going to be all that significant in the long run. But the drama, the soap opera of this is that an OpenAI engineer went and looked at this and looked at the benchmarks that xAI was using to claim, and apparently xAI didn't include one of these benchmarks that had, and I don't even pretend to understand all of it, but had they included it, then suddenly they wouldn't have exceeded OpenAI in the ways that they said they did. So the TechCrunch article headline is, "Did xAI lie about Grok 3's benchmarks?" And I feel like you just need a tub of popcorn and pull up a chair and watch this back and forth, because it's just the craziness of everyone trying to compete across these little benchmarks that, frankly, nobody really understands.
To me, this reminds me a lot of the data warehouse industry where everybody tries to show how their data warehouse is the fastest and most powerful, based on a set of benchmarks that they are often cherry picking to uh, demonstrate their own technology's best attributes. And I feel, and I'm not surprised to see that happening in the AI world as well. Honestly, I think a lot of the benchmarking in AI is not very useful because the real value is going to come down to actually using it and testing it out. I think a proof of concept done at scale is always going to be much more useful than any particular benchmark. But I also, honestly, when I look at XAI right now, they kind of feel like a Me Too player to me. Yes, they have a massive data center in Memphis, Tennessee, which is just a technological marvel. I'm just gonna put that flat out. Like it's amazing what scale they have created there. But as for the actual results, is it really any better or really even different from what is being created by the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic and Cohere and so many other competitors in the LLM space? It's just hard for me to really uh, point my finger to a place where I can say this is actually different in a meaningful way, other than to provide additional competition and another name on the list of benchmarked models.
Well, I think your example of data warehousing or the entire data space is actually very apropos because the reason those benchmarks were so prevalent is nobody had any other way of measuring and comparing. And I remember talking to a CIO years ago and talking about how he was looking at a benchmark, and it was a totally different kind of benchmark. It wasn't actually a technical one. But I questioned him. I said, "Why? Why are you looking at that?" And it was like, "Well, I need a way to demonstrate how what we're doing is competing in the market and where we stand. I need some way of doing that." And I think these benchmarks will show the same thing. Right now, nobody truly understands it all that well. It's very hard to do those proof of concepts that you're talking about. And so that's what we have to go on, and that's what
Mhm.
we're using. But I think it speaks more to our relative ignorance and lack of actual use cases than it does anything else. So I think my advice of your CIO is, enjoy the popcorn, watch the back and forth, and mostly disregard all of it, and
Yeah,
and
I just
focus
find
on the
it
problem.
Yeah, I just find it hard to parse something like AIME 2025 Performance Definitive Teo Taxis Edition and compare a 90.8 to an 88. When what I really want to know is, does it help me close the books? Or does it help me answer customer questions? And I think that if we can get task or role based benchmarks that are actually aligned to our work, then we're talking about something useful. But these theoretical quantitative indexes just don't do it for me.
Yeah, and part of it, I think, is a function of what I just talked about. Part of it's a function, I think, of the geekiness of the fact we have a bunch of engineers at all these companies that are doing all of this. I think in the case specifically of Grok, what I think I'm curious about is that their big claim was that they had access to all of the Twitter data to train the models on, and that therefore, because that was quote unquote normal conversational sort of interactions, that it was going to therefore result in much more natural feeling interactions. And I don't know if that's actually been borne out. And the fact that they're not really hyping that any longer makes me wonder if, in fact, they're finding that's not actually proving to be true. But again, my all of that notwithstanding, I land in the same space. That is, as a CIO, I think you just tune all this out and you focus on your use cases and experiment with everything until you find what works for you.
Yes. And fortunately, it's not that hard to test any of these models out right now. Every company makes it relatively easy to get initial access and plug in and test your use case.
There you go.
Yep. All right. And on that note, here's another week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please like, please subscribe, please comment, and let us know what you want us to take on next week. Thanks a lot. Take care.